Have you ever wondered what happens when a millionaire's perfect life unravels? A millionaire CEO thought he had left nothing unfinished until a chance encounter in a hotel lobby stopped him cold, his ex holding a child with his eyes. Henry Thompson moved through the lobby of the Beverly Grand Hotel like a man who belonged everywhere. His posture was flawless, his stride deliberate, his dark hair immaculately styled as if no strand ever dared step out of place, with a sharp navy suit that mirrored the chill in his blue eyes. He was the definition of composed power. Every employee who passed him offered a quick nod, instinctively respectful, knowing exactly who he was, or at least who he appeared to be. Henry wasn't just another wealthy businessman. He was the name on contracts that closed deals worth millions, the man behind strategies that turned failing empires into rising giants. Confidence wasn't something he wore. It was part of his skin. He didn't glance around or admire the polished marble or chandelier reflections. He had stayed in this hotel dozens of times. Everything was familiar, predictable, controlled, just the way he liked it. What if that control was about to shatter? His assistant had scheduled meetings with 3 different tech founders that day, back to back, just the way he demanded. The plan was clear, no surprises until one appeared. He had nearly passed the glass-fronted cafe tucked in the corner of the lobby when something pulled at his attention. At first, he caught only a glimpse, a woman sitting near the window with a child in her arms. There was nothing extraordinary about them from a distance, but something about the woman's profile, the way she held herself, the curve of her jaw, sent a jolt through his memory. He turned his head sharply and stopped walking. It couldn't be, not here, not now. But it was Emma, the woman he had once imagined growing old with, the one he had loved with all the passion of his youth before walking away from it all in favor of ambition. He had left her 6 years ago when he had been offered an expansion deal in Asia, telling himself it was the right thing, that love could wait or be replaced. He had convinced himself she would move on, that he had moved on. Yet here she was, exactly as he remembered and yet completely different. Her hair, still a warm brown, was longer now and loosely pinned back. Her face had softened but carried quiet strength. She was holding a child, maybe 2 or 3 years old, a girl nestled in her lap with chubby arms and delicate fingers gripping a toy rabbit. And that was when Henry's world began to shift, because the little girl had dark hair and the exact same piercing blue eyes as his own. Everything in him went still. The noise of the lobby faded. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. A rush of confusion, disbelief, and something much deeper, fear, maybe even guilt, rose like a tide. Without planning to, he started walking toward them, each step heavier than the last. Emma didn't see him at first. She was gently rocking the child, whispering something with a tired but loving smile. It was only when he stood right in front of the table that she looked up. Their eyes met and time collapsed between them. Emma's face paled. Her expression moved from shock to something far more complicated, grief, anger, uncertainty, all within seconds. Henry tried to speak, but his throat closed. He forced the words out, broken and unsure, unlike anything he had said in years. Is she my daughter? Emma stared at him, blinking rapidly, trying to steady her breath. The child, unaware of the earthquake that had just cracked open the ground beneath them, babbled something and reached up to touch Emma's face. Then Emma whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "Yes, but it's too late, Henry." And just like that, everything he thought he understood about life, success, and himself came crashing down. Could this be the moment that changes everything? For a moment, Henry couldn't move. The words hung in the air like smoke, soft, delicate, but choking. Yes, but it's too late, Henry. It was the kind of sentence that didn't shout, it sliced. Emma looked down, brushing a lock of hair away from her face as if the act might somehow help her hide. The child, his daughter, a part of him, was completely unaware of the storm swirling above her. She continued to play with the toy rabbit in her lap, giggling to herself, every now and then tugging gently at Emma's sleeve for attention. Henry finally found the edge of the chair across from them and sat down slowly, unsure if he had the right to be there, unsure of anything at all. His heart pounded loud and heavy, echoing through his ribs like a warning. He opened his mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. He looked at the girl, then back at Emma. It was like seeing his entire life refracted through a cracked mirror, familiar, but painfully different. Emma sighed. It wasn't theatrical or angry. It was the sigh of someone who had been carrying a weight for far too long. She looked up at him, her brown eyes tired, guarded. "You weren't supposed to be here," she said, her voice calm but distant. "This city, this hotel. We were just passing through on our way to visit my sister." "I didn't plan this." Henry swallowed, trying to find his voice. "I didn't either." He finally managed, his words sounding rough and small. "Emma, why didn't you tell me?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I did, or at least I tried. I sent messages, emails. I even showed up at your office once back when I was 6 months pregnant. Your assistant said you were in Shanghai, said you didn't take walk-ins. I left my number. No one ever called." Henry's face tightened, his stomach twisting with guilt. That period of his life was a blur of boardrooms, flights, and hotel rooms. He had become obsessed with expansion, with building something bigger than anyone thought possible. He had thought he was chasing greatness. Now it felt like he'd been running from everything that actually mattered. "I didn't know," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice trembling. "I swear to you, Emma, if I had known." Her eyes met his, sharp and unflinching. "But you didn't know because you never looked back." That silenced him. He couldn't argue with it. She was right. He had buried their past under success, assuming it would fade away like all the other sacrifices he had made for his career. But she hadn't faded. And now neither had the consequences. Emma looked down at the girl in her lap. "Her name is Sophie. She's 3. Loves pancakes and stories about talking animals. She's terrified of thunder and insists on wearing mismatched socks because she says it helps her run faster." Her lips curled slightly as she spoke, her voice softening. "She's kind, stubborn, smart, and she's been mine since the day she was born." Henry blinked, trying to absorb all of it. Every detail felt like a drop in a glass already too full. "Can I?" He hesitated, afraid of the answer. "Can I meet her? Talk to her?" Emma's jaw clenched slightly. "I don't know. She doesn't know who you are. To her, you're just a stranger." She looked at him with something like pain in her eyes. "You left before she was even real to you, and I had to be both parents. I've done everything alone." He nodded slowly, shame prickling hot behind his eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know what I'm asking for. I want to try. Please, Emma. Let me try." She studied him for a long time, saying nothing. Then she looked down at Sophie again, brushing a hand over her daughter's hair. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and steady. "We're leaving tomorrow morning. If you want to see her again, be here at 8. Henry exhaled, a flicker of hope cutting through the chaos. He nodded. "I'll be here." Emma stood slowly, lifting Sophie into her arms with practiced ease. The girl stirred slightly but didn't wake. Without another word, Emma turned and walked away through the lobby, disappearing into the elevator. Henry sat there long after the doors closed, staring at the reflection in the hotel window. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what kind of man he saw. The next morning, Henry arrived at the hotel cafe just before 7. He hadn't slept. Not really. He had spent the night pacing the floor of his suite, thoughts tumbling over themselves like waves in a storm. He kept replaying the conversation with Emma, the shock in her voice, the quiet heartbreak in her eyes, and the soft, unbelievable weight of the child in her arms, his daughter. A child he hadn't known existed. A child who had been growing, learning, laughing, crying, all without him. He had always prided himself on control, on precision, timing, foresight. But nothing in his perfectly crafted world had prepared him for this. No business deal, no crisis management, no leadership seminar had given him the tools to face the reality of a daughter he never knew he had. And now he had a single chance, maybe the only one he would get to step into her life. He wasn't sure what he would say or how he would act. He only knew that he had to be there. The cafe was quiet, only a few guests scattered across tables with newspapers and half-finished breakfasts. He chose a seat near the corner where he could see the lobby clearly. His hands fidgeted on the table as he watched the elevators, heart pounding every time one of them dinged. Part of him feared she wouldn't come. That Emma had changed her mind. That he had already lost everything before it even began. At exactly 8:03, the doors opened and there they were. Emma stepped out first, carrying a small backpack over one shoulder and holding Sophie's tiny hand. The girl looked well rested, her hair tied in two uneven pigtails, wearing a purple hoodie with cartoon cats and tiny glittering shoes that lit up when she walked. She was talking to Emma about something with great enthusiasm, gesturing wildly with her free hand. Emma smiled softly but looked tired, cautious. When her eyes met Henry's, her smile faded. He stood as they approached, his chest tightening at the sight of Sophie so close. She looked up at him curiously, her eyes narrowing slightly the way children do when they sense something unusual in a stranger. She didn't hide behind Emma. She just stared, analyzing him without fear. "Hi," Henry said, his voice gentler than he intended, almost fragile. "You must be Sophie." The girl nodded slowly. "Aha." Emma crouched beside her, whispering something Henry couldn't hear. Sophie glanced at her, then back at him. "This is the man I told you about," Emma said aloud. "The one who wants to be your friend." Sophie tilted her head. "You look serious," she said, crossing her arms. Henry blinked, then smiled slightly, caught off guard by her honesty. "I guess I do," he admitted. "Would it help if I told you I brought muffins?" She considered that, then looked up at her mom, who gave the slightest nod. Sophie shrugged. "Okay, but only if they're the kind without raisins." He laughed, tension breaking slightly as he pulled a small paper bag from the chair beside him. "No raisins, I promise." They sat at the table, Emma with a coffee, Sophie with a chocolate chip muffin in hand, and crumbs already dotting the table. Henry watched her, amazed by how real she was. Every motion, every expression was new and familiar all at once. He saw pieces of Emma in the way Sophie furrowed her brow when focused, and pieces of himself, too many to ignore, in the shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head, the serious way she studied the world. So Sophie said between bites, "What do you do?" "I help people build big things." Henry answered, "Sometimes buildings, sometimes companies." She nodded slowly, clearly unimpressed. "That sounds boring." Emma nearly choked on her coffee, quickly covering her mouth. Henry chuckled and leaned forward. "It can be, but I'm trying something new now." "What?" Sophie asked, licking chocolate from her fingers. "I'm trying to learn how to be good at something small," he said, meeting her gaze. "Something very important." She stared at him for a moment, not quite understanding, then popped the rest of the muffin into her mouth. "Okay," she mumbled. "Good luck." Emma's eyes softened, watching the two of them. She hadn't expected much. Honestly, she wasn't sure she even wanted this meeting to happen at first. But the way Sophie looked at him, unafraid, curious, open, it stirred something she thought had long since closed. Henry didn't push. He didn't call himself her father or demand more time. He listened. He answered questions. He asked her favorite color. He guessed wrong, then made her laugh by insisting his favorite was rainbow sparkle with a hint of pancake. He let her talk and took every word like it was gold. When it was time to go, Sophie waved goodbye and took Emma's hand. As they walked toward the exit, she turned back once more and said, "You can bring more muffins next time." Henry felt something expand in his chest, something warm and fragile. He nodded. "I will." And for the first time in his life, it wasn't a promise made to impress. It was one he intended to keep. The following week felt unlike anything Henry had ever experienced. For years, his days had been ruled by meetings, conference calls, investor updates, and private flights. Now, he found himself checking his watch not for deadlines, but for the time Sophie and Emma would arrive at the park just across from the hotel. He had extended his stay indefinitely, canceling trips and postponing deals, something his assistant had never seen him do before. When pressed for a reason, all he said was, "Something more important came up." And that was the truth. Every morning, he arrived early, often before the park's fountains had been switched on. He sat on the same bench near the playground and waited. When he saw them walking toward him, Sophie skipping ahead, Emma always a few paces behind, his chest tightened in a way he hadn't thought possible. It wasn't nerves anymore. It was something deeper, something unfamiliar, but welcome. A sense of wanting to earn his place, not demand it. At first, Sophie treated him like a new toy. Curious, amused, sometimes testing boundaries with innocent but direct questions. Why do you walk funny in your shiny shoes? Do you know how to climb trees? Have you ever made slime? He answered every question without hesitation, often clumsily, but always honestly. Emma stayed nearby, quietly observing. She didn't interfere, didn't guide, but she also didn't leave. That in itself was a kind of progress. Henry began to learn things no business education had ever taught him. He learned how to push a swing at just the right rhythm. He discovered how hard it was to braid hair that wriggled and danced in the wind. He found out that kids didn't care about money or titles. They cared about time, attention, and whether you listened when they talked about dinosaurs or their dreams of building a house made entirely of jelly beans. He began showing up not only with muffins, but with sidewalk chalk, bubble wands, and once a half-deflated soccer ball that he tried and failed to re-inflate in the hotel bathroom. Sophie's laughter became the soundtrack of his mornings. She called him Henry at first, but by the third visit, she had shortened it to Hen, which he pretended not to like just to hear her giggle when she used it again. She liked to grab his hand when crossing the street and insisted that he hold the bucket at the sandbox while she built the tallest cake tower in the world. He followed her lead without question, marveling at how someone so small could take up so much space in his heart so quickly. Emma remained guarded. She wasn't unkind, but she was careful. She often brought a book and read it nearby, always listening but giving space. One afternoon, while Sophie was climbing the jungle gym, Henry found the courage to speak to her. Not as the CEO, not as the man from her past, but as someone trying to rebuild something he didn't know he had destroyed. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," he said quietly, not looking at her directly. "I probably don't deserve that yet. But I want to try. I want to be part of her life, even if it's from a distance at first. I missed everything and I know that's my fault." Emma didn't answer right away. She closed her book and set it on her lap, her fingers tracing the edge of the cover. "It's not about what you missed," she said finally. "It's about what you do next." Henry looked at her then. Her face wasn't soft, but it wasn't cold either. She was tired. He could see that, but there was a flicker of something beneath the surface. Maybe not forgiveness, but willingness. And that gave him hope. Sophie came running back, her face red with excitement. "Hen, I did it. I climbed all the way to the top." He stood up, clapping with exaggerated pride. "Did you? Show me again." And she did, twice. That night, back in his suite, Henry sat by the window and stared at the lights of the city below. He had been here dozens of times before, but it had never felt like this. For the first time in years, the silence in his room didn't feel peaceful. It felt empty. He looked around at the sleek, impersonal furniture, the untouched minibar, the cold perfection of it all, and he knew one thing with certainty. He didn't want to live in a world where Sophie and Emma weren't part of it. And if there was still a chance, even the smallest one, to build something real with them, he was going to take it. Every day, as long as it took. The first time Sophie reached for his hand without being asked, Henry felt something shift deep inside him, something irreversible. It happened on a cool morning when the wind carried the smell of damp grass and distant coffee. They were walking along the edge of the park past the pond where ducks gathered and toddlers tossed crumbs when she simply slipped her fingers into his. It wasn't dramatic or planned. It was natural, instinctive, as if her small hand had always belonged there. Henry didn't look down right away, afraid to spook the moment, afraid she might take it back. When he finally did, he saw her swinging their hands gently, humming to herself. She didn't even seem to notice what she'd done, but he did, and it nearly broke him. Emma noticed, too. She didn't say anything, But her expression softened just slightly when she caught the sight of them walking ahead of her. There was still caution in her eyes, always, but less of the guarded distance that had once framed every glance. The ice between them hadn't melted entirely, but cracks had started to form. As the days passed, Henry and Sophie began developing a rhythm all their own. She insisted on telling him bedtime stories instead of the other way around, which she delivered with wild improvisation, casting him as a dragon who made blueberry pancakes and a robot who forgot how to dance. He laughed like he hadn't in years, the kind of laughter that came from somewhere buried deep, pure, unfiltered, and long overdue. She had a way of bringing light into whatever room she entered, and he found himself craving that light more with every visit. One afternoon, while Emma was on a work call nearby, Henry sat with Sophie at a picnic table, helping her sort through a messy pile of crayons and sticker sheets. She had decided they were going to make a book, and he was tasked with gluing everything down exactly right. As they worked, she asked suddenly, "Hen, why weren't you there when I was a baby?" The question hit him like a punch to the chest. It was innocent, curious, without bitterness, but it still cut deep. He looked at her small face, serious and focused, waiting for an answer she probably didn't fully understand. "I didn't know about you, Sophie," he said gently. "I wish I had. If I had known, I would have been there every single day." She considered that. "Mommy said you were busy with work." "I was," he admitted, "but if I had known I had a daughter like you, work wouldn't have mattered so much." She didn't respond right away. Then she nodded, peeled a glittery unicorn sticker from the sheet, and handed it to him. "You can put this one on the front. It's the best one. You can only use it if it's for someone really special." Henry placed the sticker carefully on the front of the page. His hands trembled slightly, but he smiled. "Then it belongs here." Later that evening, Emma approached him while Sophie was distracted, chasing birds near the edge of the lawn. Her expression was unreadable, her arms crossed, but there was something in the way she stood, a stillness that hadn't been there before. "She asks a lot of questions," Emma said quietly. "I know," Henry replied. "She deserves answers." Emma looked at him. Her voice dropped just above a whisper. "You're doing better than I expected." He didn't respond right away. He didn't want to ruin the moment with pride or excuses. "I'm trying," he said finally. "Every day, I'm trying." She nodded. It wasn't a smile, not fully, but her lips didn't press quite so tightly together. "She likes you a lot." "I like her too," he said. "More than I know how to say." They stood in silence for a few moments, watching Sophie twirl with her arms out, dizzy and delighted with nothing but the air around her. Then Emma turned to him again. "Would you like to walk her home with us today?" Henry met her gaze, surprised. "I'd love to." That evening, for the first time, he saw the inside of their small apartment, modest, a little cluttered, filled with the kind of warmth that couldn't be bought. There were crayon drawings on the fridge, fairy tale books stacked in corners, and a faint smell of cinnamon in the air. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't polished, but it was real, and it felt more like home than any place he'd ever owned. As he helped Sophie hang up her tiny jacket and set the table for a simple dinner, something inside him quietly settled. He didn't know what the future would look like, and he didn't expect it to be perfect. But he knew this. He wanted to be in it. Not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as part of the family he had nearly lost without even knowing it existed. And for the first time in his life, that thought didn't scare him. It gave him hope. The call came just after midnight. Henry had barely fallen asleep, still in his clothes from the day, his thoughts tangled around Sophie's laughter and the quiet way Emma had smiled when he'd read her daughter a story before bed. His phone buzzed against the nightstand, and the screen lit up with Emma's name. He sat up immediately, heart jumping to his throat. Calls at that hour never came with good news. "Something's wrong," Emma said the moment he answered. Her voice was tight, rushed, her words brittle with worry. "She's burning up. I've tried everything, but her fever won't go down. I don't know what to do." "I'm coming," Henry said before she could say anything more. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He threw on a jacket, grabbed his keys, and was out the door within minutes. The streets were quiet as he drove, streetlights casting long, lonely shadows across the road. He kept checking the clock, silently cursing every red light. All the power he had, all the influence. And yet, in this moment, he felt helpless. He couldn't negotiate with fevers or bribe away the fear that clawed at his chest. He could only go be there, do what he should have been doing from the very beginning. When Emma opened the door, she looked pale, frantic, her hair disheveled, her hands trembling. Sophie was curled up on the couch, flushed and glassy-eyed, her cheeks too red, her breathing shallow. Henry crossed the room without a word and knelt beside her. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm here." Sophie stirred, her eyes fluttering open briefly. "Hen," she mumbled, barely audible. "Yeah," he said, swallowing hard. "I'm right here." They ended up at the emergency clinic down the street, Emma riding in the back seat, cradling Sophie in her arms while Henry drove, one hand clenched around the wheel, the other reaching back to touch Sophie's foot, needing some kind of contact, some reassurance she was still there. The clinic lights were too bright, the waiting room too cold, but they didn't leave her side for a second. Nurses moved efficiently around them, taking temperatures, checking vitals, and murmuring reassuring things that didn't fully register. Hours passed like smoke, insubstantial, but suffocating. When the doctor finally returned and confirmed it was a viral fever and not something worse, the air seemed to return to the room in a rush. Emma sagged against the wall in relief, and Henry realized how rigid he'd been sitting, his whole body one tight like a spring. They took Sophie home just before dawn. She was still weak, but resting better, curled in her bed with a damp cloth on her forehead and her toy rabbit tucked under one arm. Henry and Emma sat in the dim kitchen, nursing cups of lukewarm tea. Neither of them spoke at first. The exhaustion was too deep, too thick. But there was a new kind of silence between them now. Not cold, not distant, just real. "She asked for you," Emma said quietly after a while. "Before I called, she wanted you." Henry stared into his tea, his hands wrapped around the mug like it might anchor him. "I'm glad you did." "I didn't think I would," she admitted. "There was a moment when I reached for the phone, I hesitated, but I couldn't do it alone anymore." "You don't have to," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked at him across the table, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, but open. "Honest. You're not the same man I knew 6 years ago." "No," he said. "I'm not. That man wouldn't have shown up. He wouldn't have deserved either of you." Emma didn't argue. She didn't offer absolution. But she reached across the table and touched his hand, her fingers light, tentative. He turned his palm up and closed his hand around hers. They sat like that in silence, the room growing lighter as the first hints of morning crept through the window. Upstairs, Sophie stirred and murmured something in her sleep. For the first time, Henry didn't feel like a visitor or an outsider. He felt like someone who belonged there, not because he'd claimed it, but because he'd earned it slowly, painfully with every choice he'd made since returning. And for Emma, the walls she had spent so long building didn't fall. But they softened enough to let in the possibility of something new, something repaired, something real. The following weeks passed quietly, but with a rhythm that felt more natural each day. There were no declarations, no dramatic turning points, just small, steady shifts in the way Henry moved through their lives. He no longer knocked when he came over. Emma had given him a spare key after Sophie insisted he needed one, just in case of important tea parties. He started showing up with groceries, with coloring books, with forgotten school supplies. Sometimes he brought nothing but himself, and that turned out to be enough. Sophie began calling him Dad one afternoon without any warning. They had been sitting at the kitchen table cutting out paper stars for a school project when she held one up, looked at him with a wrinkled nose, and asked, "Do you think this one's too sparkly, Dad?" She said it casually with complete comfort as if she'd been calling him that her entire life. Henry froze for a second. The scissors paused mid-cut in his hand. Emma glanced up from the counter, watching him closely, but he didn't look at her. He didn't want to scare the moment away. He just smiled, cleared his throat, and replied, "No, I think it's perfect." From that moment on, everything deepened. Sophie became more attached, more open. She'd curl up in his lap after dinner with books, her tiny voice narrating stories and correcting his pronunciation with theatrical sighs. She asked him to come to her preschool's open house, to meet her teacher, to look at the finger painting of their family, which now had 3 figures holding hands. Henry stared at the drawing for a long time, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the paper. He didn't take a photo of it. He asked if he could keep the original. Emma had softened too, though her trust unfolded more slowly. She didn't say much about the shift she was seeing in him. She didn't need to. It was in the way she lingered longer in the kitchen after Sophie went to bed. The way she asked his opinion on small things like what new shoes to buy or which bedtime snack Sophie would like better. She still hesitated, especially when the subject of the future came up. She wasn't ready to talk about long-term plans or labels. But she stopped correcting Sophie when she introduced Henry as her dad. That alone said everything. One evening, while they were cleaning up after dinner, Emma found Henry standing in the hallway, staring at a framed photo of her and Sophie from 2 years ago. Sophie had cake on her face, and Emma's eyes were tired but happy. He traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, lost in thought. "I wasn't there," he said, not turning around. "For that birthday or the first or any of the moments that came before. I missed them all." Emma leaned against the wall beside him, her arms folded but relaxed. "You can't go back," she said softly. "But you're here now." He looked at her then. "Is that enough?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's something. And maybe that's more than I expected." He nodded slowly, accepting her honesty without resentment. He knew that trust couldn't be demanded. It had to be built moment by moment, just like everything else that mattered. He was no longer trying to repair the past. He was building something in the present, and that perhaps was more powerful. That same week, Henry took a quiet step of his own. He put his penthouse up for sale, the one with the view of the skyline and the floors so polished they barely felt lived in. He told no one at first, not even Emma. He found a house instead, smaller, warmer, with a yard and a creaky porch and space for a swing. It wasn't a palace. It was a place to grow. When he finally told Emma, she didn't say anything for a while. They were sitting on the couch, Sophie already asleep upstairs. She looked at him with a question in her eyes, not spoken, but felt. "I'm not asking you to move in," he said carefully. "I'm just trying to get closer to the life I want. And that life, it has you in it." Her eyes dropped to her hands where she was absently twisting the edge of a throw pillow. "I've spent a long time not depending on anyone," she said quietly. "It's scary to start." "I know," he replied. "But I'm not going anywhere." He didn't press for more. He didn't expect a grand reaction. He simply meant what he said. That night, before she went to bed, Emma paused at the door. She looked at him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said finally, "for showing up." And for Henry, those words were worth more than any contract, any empire, any $1 million deal he had ever signed. Because for the first time in his life, he was being thanked for being a man. Not a name, not a title, not a success, just a man, a father, a part of something real. Autumn arrived with golden leaves and cooler mornings, wrapping the city in a kind of calm that made everything feel softer. The park was no longer filled with summer crowds, but Henry still came almost every day. It had become a ritual, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The air smelled of cinnamon and damp earth, and Sophie had taken to wearing her favorite orange sweater with a pumpkin stitched on the front, claiming it made her run faster. Henry always pretended to be amazed by this, chasing her through the grass as she shrieked with laughter. It was a sound he had grown addicted to, the kind of laughter that made his chest ache in the best possible way. By now, everything between them had changed. He no longer felt like a guest in their lives, but something closer to family. He picked Sophie up from preschool on Mondays and Fridays, and she ran to him with open arms, calling out, "Dad," as if it were the most natural word in the world. He helped Emma with grocery runs, fixed the squeaky cabinet in the kitchen, and once spent an entire afternoon assembling a dollhouse with instructions written in what he swore was ancient Greek. He didn't care. Every minute spent with them added another thread to the life he was weaving. A life that for once didn't feel temporary. Emma had changed, too. She smiled more often, not just for Sophie, but for herself. Her shoulders didn't seem as tense, her words not as guarded. She still had her boundaries, her independence, and Henry respected that deeply. But there were nights now when they shared a glass of wine on the balcony after Sophie had gone to bed. They talked about the past, what had gone wrong, what they had missed, what they would never get back. But more often they talked about the present, and sometimes when the night was quiet enough, about the future. One afternoon, Sophie came home with a handmade card in her backpack covered in glitter and crooked letters. She had written it in class with help from her teacher and had waited until dinner to give it to him. Inside in messy crayon writing were the words, "Thank you for finding me, Daddy. I love you." He didn't cry in front of her. He just hugged her and told her it was the best thing anyone had ever given him. Later, when the house was quiet and Sophie was asleep, he sat on the couch with the card in his hands, tears silently rolling down his cheeks. Emma sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder without a word. A few days later, he asked if they wanted to see the house. The one he had bought, the one he hadn't shown anyone else. It wasn't a proposal. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. Emma looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. So that weekend, they drove out to the quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets and children riding scooters down the sidewalks. The house was simple but warm with a porch swing and enough rooms for sleepovers and bedtime stories. Sophie ran from room to room, already deciding where to hang her drawings and which bedroom would be hers. Emma walked through the space slowly, touching walls, looking out windows, thinking. At the end of the tour, they stood in the empty living room, sunlight spilling through the windows in soft ribbons. Henry turned to her, his hands in his pockets. "I don't need an answer now," he said. "But I want you to know this house isn't mine unless it has both of you in it." She looked around the room, then at him, and finally at Sophie dancing in circles on the bare floor. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "We're not ready to move in yet," she said. "But we're ready to come back tomorrow." He smiled, understanding exactly what she meant. That evening, they left the house with the promise of return, their footprints the first to mark the front walkway. As they walked back to the car, Sophie reached up and took both of their hands, swinging between them as she skipped. It was a small thing, but it felt like the start of something permanent. They weren't a perfect family. They were something better, real, built not from clean slates or fairy tales, but from second chances, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. And this time, Henry wasn't late. He was right on time.